Hi, everyone, and welcome to a very topical panel of the Colaba conversation here in Mumbai, where we'll discuss the lessons from the pandemic and how we can move towards making our cities more resilient. As we all know, city governments, infrastructure, and systems have been severely tested during the pandemic. Strengthening health systems and social infrastructure and creating institutional mechanisms to raise resources to be deployed at times of crisis are crucial elements to boost resilience and hasten recovery. This session will look at how city governance, city planning, and the allocation of resources must be integrated with community engagement to build back better and build back stronger and together. To discuss these issues, we have a stellar panel that has deep insight into the problems facing us today, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce them. Ashwini Bhide, Additional Municipal Commissioner, Municipal Corporation of Greater Mumbai; Nicholas Brook, Chairman, Urban Land Institute Asia Pacific; Regina Ramos, Deputy Director of Pilots and Innovation at the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority; and Shruti Narayan, who's the C40 Regional Director for South and West Asia. Thank you to all of you for taking out the time today from various time zones to join us for this important conversation. I'd like to start this panel by inviting all of you to give some opening comments on the lessons we've learned from the pandemic and how we can structure the conversation accordingly going forward. Ashwini ji, if you could start with your comments.
Yeah, hi, hello everyone. We all know that the pandemic has been very overwhelming for across the globe. And while many cities, even with the best of the health infrastructure, did falter while managing the pandemic, Mumbai came out with flying colors, not only in pandemic management, but also in terms of bouncing back to its regular activities without facing a second wave. Now, there were many lessons which we learned during this process and why Mumbai could achieve it. I think the questions which we want to explore in this panel discussion could be found out in understanding how Mumbai dealt with this pandemic. Mumbai was very nimble, swift, and quick in terms of its responses, even though there was initially they were overwhelmed. First of all, Mumbai is kind of used to different kinds of crisis situations because of its own geographic and extreme weather conditions. It is, in a way, a financially autonomous organization, doesn't depend on the state or federal government. But at the same time, Mumbai this time, which was very uniquely, they did try to leverage whatever resources the city has in different sectors. The private sector, Mumbai being a hub of business tycoons, tech companies, voluntary organizations, and very enthusiastic citizen groups, Mumbai ensured that they involved this entire community in the process of pandemic management, and that is why they could raise huge resources in terms of the financial support, in technical support, technology support, as well as the human resource support, especially in the beginning under lockdown, where situations were quite constrained. Another thing Mumbai did is they managed the pandemic by leveraging the AI and all the digitalization of information. The kind of because again we got a lot of support from different tech companies and AI companies, and Mumbai used all this technical support for accurate data capture, proper surveillance, information dissemination, even diagnostics. Because initially, when the testing kits were limited, Mumbai used tech platforms to diagnose not only the virus infection but also for comorbidities. And then bed allotment management, bed management, ambulance management, even the predictive analysis and resource planning. So that was the way it was used, by involving again the community, voluntary participation, which Mumbai has never been able to do otherwise. In addition to that, the kind of basically the infrastructure we set up at a very short call, the various jumbo centers and COVID care centers, and huge infrastructure was created at a very short span, ensuring quality of service and cost effectiveness, because all these facilities were free for the citizens, but the quality was outstanding. This was completely opposite of the normal experience of the public health infrastructure which the citizens has. This was something uniquely done. where the COVID patients, so the citizens were at the center of this whole management. So this citizen-centric approach, which otherwise we talk about, but generally not practiced, this was hugely used, and that helped us in actually controlling the pandemic. In addition to that, the administrative setup, we achieved that administrative nimbleness, quick decision making, whatever the regular bureaucratic uh, basically stumbling blocks were removed, the processes were immediately tuned to the requirement of this new situation. Most of the times, there are interdepartmental, interorganizational rivalries and lack of coordination. All these things were overcome, and there are multiple examples to show this. And probably under this kind of pandemic situation, this was achieved. And the most important factor was transparency of information. We learned here that by directly communicating with the community, giving transparent information on each and every aspect and getting their feedback, that was very important. And that, because the kind of dashboards which we are publishing, every information was in public domain, it was accessible to people. And in addition to that, there was a very collaborative network of which was a very robust network of voluntary organizations, even media, and whoever could give the citizens feedback to us and share what BMC is doing for them. While the central management was always, core team was always, they provided the kind of leadership which was based on data driven insights. They were very well informed, and that is why they were very dynamic in their decision making. We were continuously changing our policies, which doesn't normally happen with the government. We were very, very accessible to all the responses which were taken. But at the same time, our field organization was absolutely distributed and decentralized. We set up ward level war rooms, and through that the ward level teams were directly connected to citizens 24/7, getting their feedbacks. So I think all these things which otherwise is not seen in administration was tried during this pandemic. And I think these are the learning lessons. We completely changed gear, reinvented ourselves, I would say. So this pandemic, while it unearthed some fissures and gaps in our capabilities to deal with this situation, but at the same time, it also harnessed a lot of hidden strengths, potential, and possibilities. Now the challenge is going to be how to institutionalize this, because the whole organization worked in a different way in last almost 9 months. They were on a completely different track. But once we start moving towards normalcy, how to institutionalize it and make it part of our regular protocol, and how administration is more citizen centric, that is going to be a challenge. But I think the lessons we learned and the way we dealt with the situation, that is why Mumbai is almost back to normal. Our cases are very, very less, limited, under control. We have now enough health infrastructure to deal with even some spikes which may happen in future. And all the protocols, processes, treatment protocol, testing protocols, everything is set now. We know where the bumps could be and how to address them. So these are the learnings from this pandemic for Mumbai.
Right. And Mumbai was clearly able to avoid the second wave, and clearly data generation and transparency and coordination between departments, as you said, was important for the dissemination of services and general awareness generation. Nicholas, I'd like to turn to you now for your perspective from your part of the world.
Thank you very much. Well, my perspective is from Hong Kong. And I mean, here in Hong Kong, we were undoubtedly caught unaware. We were not prepared with the advent of COVID. And it's proved a very painful experience, I think it's fair to say. And we're not out of the woods yet. But the positive side, and I'll talk about some of the lessons that have been learned and the implications that are being absorbed, are very positive, I think. And we're finding solutions across a whole range of challenges and issues that have surfaced. Just by very background, we're a city of 7.5 million people, very compact city, very dense city, as you know, example of urbanization, but that in itself is a challenge when it comes to COVID. I think there are a number of positives from Hong Kong's perspective. I think what the pandemic has done is made us look at risk in a much wider sense. So here in Hong Kong, a much greater priority is now being paid to risk. And that's not just pandemic, it's climate change, it's natural disaster, financial crisis, even the failure of the city systems and governance. So we've taken pandemic, if you like, as a wake-up call to look at the whole aspect of resilience across all issues, and not just the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic is with us, but there are other issues that we need to address going forward. And what's positive also is there's an acceptance of the need to adopt a resilience agenda to mitigate against such unexpected and disruptive events. So at city level, at government level, part of the way forward and part of the program at the moment is to develop that resilience agenda. There's also, just echoing what was being said earlier, an acceptance of the need for a collaborative approach. And in particular, realization that a resilient system looks beyond neighborhood, looks beyond district, looks beyond city, even has to look at government level. So there are different levels of resilience, but they all have to be interrelated, from building through district, through neighborhood to city. So I think this need for the collaborative approach is becoming very clear. And also the need to involve both the public and the private sector. Hitherto, I think we've relied too much, if you like, on government, and the private sector clearly has got a role and a part to play. This business, again, picking up Mumbai's point, realization that sharing of resilience information and useful data is essential. And it's not a business risk. To share is not a risk. If you wish to create the collaborative ecosystem which spurs innovation and motivates the market, then you have to share, and this data has to be readily available. Engaging with the community. This is something haven't been particularly good at in the past, but we feel there's a need to develop a strong resilience narrative which motivates and engages the whole of society in order to achieve better alignment and common understanding. And you might smile at this, but we believe there's a need to embark on a storytelling communication strategy which joins the dots. Again, it has to be brought down to a dimension, if you like, that the man in the street, if you like, understands. So storytelling, we feel, is part of this, and joining the dots is very crucial. Changing attitudes and accelerating mitigation and adaptation measures. And interesting, one of the things that the Chief Executive talks quite a lot here about is moving from just in time to just in case. So this is an interesting way of looking at things. So hitherto, we've probably been doing things on a just in time basis, but now she would prefer us to look at things on a just in case basis. And as a result, enhance the city's livability and quality of life, and in particular, protect the most vulnerable, and reap what we describe as the resilience dividend. Again, maybe this is parlance, maybe this is a bit of speak, if you like, but there clearly is a dividend, if you like, from a resilience agenda and all these initiatives we're going to be talking about today. And I think we should be talking more about the plus side, the resilience dividends, I'd describe it. And I think we think that dividends are clearly to be reaped from resilience investment, and this is something that we perhaps as cities we should be developing. The other thing that obviously we're debating and talking about a lot is that there are both value and cost implications, and we need to particularly measure and to publicise the financial and social costs of inaction, the costs of doing nothing. Which again, I think is something that hasn't really been focused on going forward. And again, in Hong Kong, that's going to be part of our pitch, if you like. We're going to have examples of the cost of doing nothing. And we're going to be publicising the fact that the failure to recognise the need to respond is not just a matter of reputational risk anymore, but it's social and financial risk. And it impacts not only asset values, if you like, but also the community's sense of belonging and confidence in leadership. So again, we want to publicise that quite strongly. One of the things we found, and I'm sure this can come out in the discussion, the market doesn't really sufficiently price for resilience. There's no premium for being a good boy, if you like, and undertaking resilient initiatives, but there's similarly no penalty if you don't. So again, we hope that the market will start to recognise the value of resilience and penalise those who take little no action. And we feel that resilience is treated as a compliance issue and not a wider community risk. We think there's the need to enhance risk assessment processes, and again, Mumbai touched on this, and capabilities. And again, we've been looking at standards, and we've been looking at how to measure. And we think that there is a lot of work to be done on achieving industry agreement on standardizing methodology for assessing risk and determining impact. Lots of measures, but none of them seem to be universally accepted. We think that the importance of data is crucial. We need to create a frequently updated and standardized data set, I think at a cross-city level, which enables us all to speak the same language and better access across disparate markets. Two other issues I just wanted to mention, the funding of resilience. Again, in Hong Kong, we're looking very closely at that. We need to promote the role of green finance and green bonds, and we already have issued a number of green bonds here in Hong Kong, and other impact investment initiatives. Also very interesting here in Hong Kong, we're seeing the emergence of sustainability-linked loans based on green criteria. So if you can demonstrate the adherence to the green criteria, you can get loans on more favourable terms, if you like, than the standard loan. So that we think is very encouraging. We're also talking very carefully at Hong Kong about the introduction of what I describe as a carrot and stick approach, which would include the introduction of carbon taxes, which would be based on the operational performance of buildings. Now, obviously, that has to be taken at a certain pace, if you like, but we do believe that that is part of the resilience agenda I was talking about earlier. And then finally, we believe, and again, we're talking to our planning departments and our designers, we think there needs to be an innovative design response from the design and planning community. Because climate resilient planning and solutions invariably challenge existing planning practices and regulations. And we feel there's a need for increasing flexibility in planning procedures and indeed the creation of a green lane development channel. We intend to create a champion for the development of climate resilient design. None of the regulations at the moment recognise or give credence to this aspect. We're looking at producing a new set of green building regulations and zoning guidelines. We're going to embark on some pilot projects to demonstrate practicability and value-related benefits. And most important of all, and the biggest challenge, and I'm sure we can talk about this, is we're going to review how existing buildings infrastructure can become more resilient. The new build in the new production, if you like, is the easy part. It's what you do with your existing stock and your existing infrastructure and how you try and make that resilient. So that's what we're at to in Hong Kong. I hope that's helpful. Happy to take questions and talk more during the panel session. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think what you said about resilience being a compliance issue was very interesting. And I'll get to that question later of how maybe we can create a resilience agenda, which is regional or even international, and have a more standardized risk assessment criteria for cities. Regina, I'd like to turn to you now for your perspective from the West and a particular sector as well. So if you can give your comments.
Thank you, Aditi, for this opportunity. So in the area of public transit, resiliency is generally equated to the ability to deliver services despite challenges and disruptions, whether it's the weather, like here in Boston, or a global health crisis. COVID-19 has exposed the vulnerabilities of public transit at a scale we never imagined. Ridership has fallen to historic lows. COVID also has highlighted how essential public transit is in shuttling our frontline workers. We are learning many lessons, we still are, from this pandemic. And here, in my opinion, are some of the highlights from this experience from the perspective of resiliency. The ability to act swiftly, deliberately, in the most informed fashion is crucial. Close and sustained coordination and collaboration across government agencies allowed us to effectively support the public health sector and frontline workers through our services. We also found interjurisdictional communications with other transit agencies to be very fruitful, as it gave us a window to use cases and therefore saved us so much time. Sustained public engagement was as vital, and all these allowed us to act swiftly and decisively. Along with ensuring the safety of our passengers, the health and well-being of our operators was as paramount. Thus, the implementation of simultaneous endeavor under a unified strategy, such as rear door boarding, cashless transactions, increasing frequency when needed, launching a public safety campaign in transit, were key in managing the crisis. Public transit resiliency is very much tied to flexibility and adaptability. The delivery of efficient and responsive transit service demands flexibility and is dependent on robust data. It has been crucial to manage passenger flow. Our real-time crowding application, for instance, which we developed during this pandemic, helps riders plan and anticipate the trips, as it tells them in advance the level of crowding of their buses. Data also guides operational changes. Through data, we are able to timely respond to demands or lack thereof through surgical changes in our services of delivery. The drastic changes in public transit really beg for us to refocus and recalibrate goals and really redefine what success looks like. COVID-19 highlighted for us which routes were durable and those which were overserved. It has shown that low-income folks, people of color, are more transit dependent. And it is through these realities that goals must be recast. Over the years, public transit success has always hinged on ridership and revenue. Perhaps given our collective reality, when revenue has dropped and ridership will take time to recover, the goal should be more of providing access. A public transit system, in my view, in my own personal view, can only claim to be resilient if it is able to learn from the collective experience and transform itself. Public transit is now challenged to step up, examine with great openness its business model, and work towards a more intermodal and sustainable network, harnessing all the positives from each mode. This experience presents a unique opportunity for public transit agencies to redesign its entire network in a manner that is more responsive, that is more equitable and just. These times have forced us to ask how public transit agency sees itself at the end of this proverbial tunnel. This may require a more than a sterile review of data or economic recovery. This requires more of an intentional emphasis on the principles of environmental justice and equity.
Right, you're absolutely right. Everyone has been talking about how responsiveness is key to pandemic management. And I think the transport facility and transit facility is incredibly crucial to that. But as we redefine these systems, we also have to keep in mind sustainability and green transport. So that I think a lot of confluence in that regard. Shruti, I'd like to turn to you now for your comments of maybe perhaps a more regional perspective.
Thank you, Aditi. And the good thing about being the last one on a panel is always like, it's good because you can just be succinct and, most of the good things have been covered. But, I just kind of want to maybe capture some of the very interesting things that people have actually put forward, before me. So what is resilience? Like, what kind of lens do you look at resilience, right? I mean, that's an important thing. So, the question is that any kind of pandemic. So it's very interesting that we had a pandemic of this nature and magnitude, because it really has, the reason that we are having this conversation and with the kind of panel is because it's shaken all of us, right? At different levels, it's impacted everyone. And that's at least in my living history, it's not happened, right? And my parents, so it's clearly something that's been a wake-up call for the world, right? And therefore we're having these discussions. Now, in a situation like this, the way we start looking at resilience and how we look forward is, the first step is how do you absorb, right? Like, what is how do you absorb what's happened at your level, right? So for the city level, so what are your actions that you take? And Miss Bhide really outlined them really interestingly on how that happens. And then we had a very interesting sort of lens on urban planning and then transportation. Like how do you respond to some of the things that have happened, right? And the second is, how do you recover, right? So what are the modes of recovering, right? Because at the first layer, when these things happen, you're just kind of absorbing, right? You don't even know what's coming your way. And then the second is, how do you sort of, recover and respond, and what kind of instruments you put in place, and then how do you prepare for future pandemics? So what's important for us as a society as a whole is to be able to come out of this pandemic with instruments in place that actually are making us and ensuring that we are ready for one, to avoid such kind of pandemics, and two, to be able to respond to them more efficiently and better, and and kind of putting systems in place. So now very interesting is the fact that COVID also brought in fact and a great focus on climate change, right? I mean, I think in the beginning when COVID came about, there was a whole discussion on how the ecological destruction is actually increasing pandemics, right? And bringing us closer to these kind of, issues. And we've seen actually multiple things happen around the world. There were fires in California, in Australia. I mean, there are multiple things that have happened in coincident to this pandemic. They may not be related, right? But this year has been a very hard one, right? For the world as a whole, for different reasons, right? Which kind of brings us to the focus on how climate change is a very important lens to look at how we start looking at urban development, right? And development in general, right? And it's very important when we look at urban development because we are all city dwellers. Now, if you look at, mostly, I mean, a large percentage of the world is residing in cities. And if you look at the statistics, pandemic like COVID also impacted cities a lot more than rural and peri-urban areas. And that's because we're all living so close to each other in infrastructure that's sort of impacting us and bringing us close to each other. So when we start looking at these things, it's important, one is to, there's an important sort of saying that, we shape our buildings and then they shape us. So it's like we shape cities and then they sort of shape us, right? So when you come through these kind of pandemics, it's very important is to, number one, look at urban planning, right? And density is the key. Now, how you plan for density is also important, right? Now, if you have broad pedestrian walkways, etc., you start reducing sort of the social, like how close people are, but you're also encouraging them to walk more. And then, you kind of start looking at things in an integrated manner, right? So for example, Reggie was talking very interestingly about, sort of transportation and the response, right? The ridership went down, but it also, kind of gave people the opportunity of looking at other modes of, transportation. People were cycling. There was a lot of ownership that people took, of their own cities and their neighborhoods. And that also brings, an important point on how there has to be community participation in, planning and a lot of these exercises. And Miss Bhide made that point. And, there was a point made by Nicholas on how there has to be a sort of community participation. And we actually saw that, right? The pandemic on its own created that. People were disconnected. You couldn't even, go to your, like your parents or your friends, like you had to kind of limit yourself in that 20-minute, right? There is a rule that it's the 20-minute cities or neighborhoods where you have all your essential services within that 20-minute radius, right? So that, so those are the things, right? You start kind of bringing back to the forefront on how do you start looking at urban planning? What are your essential services? How are you interacting with people? And I mean, we're lucky we're at a time when there is data and, everybody has mentioned that data came across as a very important tool not only for citizen empowerment, but also feeding it back to the government and the government feeding it back to the citizens, and also, general dialogue of people with each other. And I think that's very, very important when we are looking at planning, is the inclusive and equitable development, right? So kind of from the density rule, you kind of move to how are you reducing distances, right? And between people. So there, when you come across the 20-minute sort of walkable neighborhoods, that is making it more, and then you look at equitable, neighborhoods, so that you're not creating ghettos. Like, Reggie mentioned that, a lot of people of color in different, even in our society, we have a lot of, informal settlements that are feeding the economy of the cities. So it's also important to, when we are looking at development, to address them and how they are living. And then you come to the lens of, how is your infrastructure, like how is all of that functioning? How is energy getting, produced? How is water and sanitation? I mean, if you look at urban designing principles of, like, in 1800s, when the plague happened, there was a whole discourse around how sanitation is very critical, and a good sanitation and water is the sign of a good city, right? Like how healthy a city is. So you also start kind of looking at, urban development from different lenses, right? And then you bring about sort of, the whole thing on how can you finance some of these things, right? And you start bringing and, including multiple stakeholders, because you need to have financial institutions in the play. You need to get banks in the play. At C40, we have a facility called the City Finance Facility, because we've been, approached by different, entities like the cities and financial institutions, where the financial institutions are ready to invest and the city wants the money, but there is a gap because there is not enough project preparation. So we're also kind of facilitating that. I'm also happy to say that Mumbai is recently signed up to C40 under the leadership of Honorable Minister Aditya Thackeray, who's been really leading sort of the effort in looking at how one can look at not only Mumbai as a city, but Maharashtra as a region, and also connect. And that was another point that was made before, by the panelists before me, that while it's important to start looking at local economies, I mean, and I think that was something that we all realized, right? We couldn't access, I mean, where is your fruits and vegetables coming from? Where are your essential services coming from? All of those things became important because we had to localize our economies. But it also was important to look at it from different, lenses. So how do you function as a local economy? How, then you kind of go beyond the city to the state and to the nation, and start looking at how are those interconnected. So I'll just pause here because, I think there's a lot to discuss, and, it's a very important topic.
Absolutely. And like you said, this pandemic has caused us to kind of step back and look at our systems and how we can maybe change them to absorb these shocks better, which makes me turn to Ashwini ma'am, because you are at the helm of urban governance and the COVID task force, and you were at the helm of the Mumbai Metro. So in your opinion, you mentioned the ways in which Mumbai has been able to tackle the crisis very well. But for future crisis management, what are some of the key priority areas you feel we could work on, change, or add to for better pandemic management in the future?
There are many things which we thought we dealt with, adequately during this pandemic. But if you really want to absorb these shocks in a better way in future, we will have to work out. First is Mumbai, because still 60 to 65% population lives in slums. So initially we had a fear that the pandemic, this whole infection will spread in this population like anything, and it will be difficult to control. Actually, it worked the other way around. Because of the population density and because of the exposure level, probably there was a natural containment of the spread of virus in these population areas. But that is not going to be the case always. These basic issues of sanitation, the access, and the proper planning within these settlements, that will have to be dealt with, keeping in mind, because this time we could escape, but that may not be the case otherwise. Second point is about transit. in Mumbai, because just to arrest the spread, we still have not restarted our suburban rail system, which is the backbone of Mumbai's transportation, and that is creating, a lot of stress in the system today, because that suburban rail is not there. So most of the transportation is happening by way of road, because Mumbai's inherent limitations in it being a linear city and the population density. Although we talk a lot about this use of cycling and other, there are inherent limitations. And in absence of the suburban rail system, we are feeling constrained. Now, Mumbai is on the is poised to expand its public transport network by way of the metro transport. Maybe another 5-6 years, a huge metro network will be there. But again, in such situation, if it is repeated, how you are going to deal with this public transportation and the problems or the challenges it would raise during such pandemic situation, or even flood situation, so many other things. So how to deal with that? We have to set up proper protocols for that. It is not only important to have these transport facilities, but to make them work and make them efficiently work even during crisis situations. So those protocols we have to set. We are still not ready for that. And of course, so many other civic amenities which are otherwise also overstressed, but during pandemic or during similar kind of crisis situation, how accessible they would be, and the equitable distribution of all these resources from the citizen perspective, how this would happen. These challenges would remain, and proper protocols will have to be set up. The risk management, the risk assessment will have to be done properly. Those standardization will have to be done, and Mumbai need to reinvent and reassess itself against those parameters. So that is going to be the challenge going forward.
Yeah, and since you mentioned having effective transportation methods during the pandemic, I think that leads to a question for Reggie. Not just about how you can make transportation effective just in the pandemic, but you also mentioned that there's been such a fall in ridership for public transit. Is that going to mean more private vehicles, or does that mean that there's being a concerted effort to create more pedestrianization? And what are the changes that we're seeing?
So I think it's a very interesting time for public transit throughout this, from the start of the pandemic to where we are right now. At the very beginning, there was a sharp fall. It was just like one day, we felt that everything just shut down. But also you see durable routes, and in the beginning, it was a heightened use of single occupancy vehicles because there was a lack of information at the very beginning. And so everyone just wanted to travel in their own cars and all that. But as the pandemic progressed and everyone started adapting to working from home and being home with their kids, you will see a spike in biking and walking. And so we have now municipalities, cities, and towns just expanding these lanes and thereby redesigning the urban space and how we share the space, right? But it's a tug and pull process for public transit because it is definitely suffering a blow, but it's very vital for economic recovery. So I think, when you speak of resiliency and how public transit interplays with that, it's going to be an iterative process and we've launched a really massive public engagement commitment. Because we not only need to focus on those who are using the public transit now and those who are likely to return. At this point, I don't think travel patterns are set in stone. I don't think that it is going to evolve as as the inoculation processes come along. And really, our role here in public transit is to keep an eye and listen to our riders, but also realize that public transit has now taken on a different role. And the role is more expanded and the role is more flexible in that it takes, people regard public transit now differently from before March, So you have to also regain their confidence in how you do that. And kind of, it relates I think public transit plays a crucial role now, also as it exposes different features in the urban society, such as housing and all that. So I think Aditi, it's going to be an iterative process. It has to be data driven, but it also has to be set in principles. How does like I said during the opening, how does a transit agency see itself at the end of this proverbial tunnel? What do we want to be? Do we want to provide people with opportunities and all of that? So I think that's the kind of precarious situation, but very, very interesting. It's a time to make, it's a revolutionary time. It can be a revolutionary time for public transit.
Right. It is a precarious situation because even in a city like Mumbai, where this conversation is based, it's an economic lifeline, the train system, but it's also so dangerous during a pandemic. So it'll be nice to take a step back and rethink our systems and how we can deliver economically as well as be safe during such times.
Can I just comment? I think the word commute is the word that's being challenged in many societies. Certainly here in Hong Kong, people travel an hour and a half each way every day. I did. But, we're seriously now looking at redistribution of labor, decentralizing quite a lot of our office stock, a lot of discussion about where people will live in the future. So I think you're right, Reggie, that your model is going to have to be looked at very closely going forward. I think the advantage is you may have a smoother pattern going forward. You may not have the peaks that you've had in the past, but I think the travel model will be somewhat different.
Absolutely. And I think my next question could be both to Nicholas and Shruti on something I mentioned previously on whether there can be a resilience agenda that is beyond just a city and a more regional or international redefined resilience agenda where we can, again, have a different standardized risk assessment system to kind of predetermine responses to crisis. Nicholas, we can start with you and then Shruti.
Well, we're fortunate, as you know, we're part of China, and China has this ambition to join us with the Greater Bay Initiative. This is a big initiative joining Hong Kong. This is 9 cities and 2 SARs, 2 special administrative regions. And the idea is that effectively it will become one huge special economic zone, if you like, over time. And we're already talking with those cities now about how going forward, particularly in the wider resilience agenda, in terms of the wider resilience agenda, if you like, how we might respond to major issues on a cluster basis, if you like, going forward. So yes, we're looking at that quite seriously. Hitherto, we've obviously planned Hong Kong as Hong Kong, but with this opportunity to become part of the Greater Bay Area, we're looking very closely at an integrated response process.
Great. Shruti, how about you?
So I think that, of course, there has to be a resilience agenda that is, that's a priority for a country, for a region. I look at a region of Southwest Asia where we have about 9 cities that are working together at C40 with, sort of the agenda of climate change that includes the resilience agenda. And there, of course, are priorities that could be at a regional level that could be defined, things like financing, etc. But I really think that this has to be something that has to be aligned to the city or, because every city faces a very specific issue with respect to what it's dealing with, what its fabric is. So, I think that you have to start connecting the dots from that level and kind of go up and also think of what kind of best practices that can be shared across, in the resilience agenda that are there. And I think that's very important. I don't know how many cities really talk to each other. One of the things that at C40 we do through our networks is, share best practices across our cities, right? And there has been, we did a lot of sort of webinars and sessions on COVID-19 recovery that, let's say, Latin America has done something that could be, inspiring for Dhaka. So those kind of things in the resilience agenda are important, but I definitely think that the structuring of it and the implementation of it and how you engage planning and, institutions and financing has to be done at somewhat of a local level for it to have a real impact.
Wonderful. I think the panel has...
I just want to add one point, if the time permits. Right now, we need to actually also revisit the current policy of city planning, which is more around land value-based usage. It should get diverted to need-based. Today, this typical model of you have a CBD and then the suburbs to just transport modes, and the affordability of people is also is thought of in a different way. But now we need people around their work areas during this kind of pandemic, or in this kind of crisis situation. So all these things will have to be kept in mind while planning the city and its expansion.
Absolutely. And again, thank you all for being here, because we've discussed lessons, we've discussed future plans, we've discussed collaboration. And I think this panel has really come together in the time of a crisis, proving that in the virtual world, we can take steps to mitigate these faults in the future. So my thanks again to all of you for taking the time out and joining us for the Colaba conversation. And hopefully next year we can have this conversation in person. So thank you again very much for your insights today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.